Welcome to everybody. I'm Fred Drummond. I'm the Director of Evangelical Alliance in Scotland. And it is fantastic to have Professor Jason Leitch with us. Jason, welcome. We are so grateful to you to give up your time. And we're also so grateful to you and your team for all the work that you've been doing over the last months. On behalf of the folks of the nation, I want to say thank you to you. And to the team who work round about you, and also to let you know that we've been praying for you and for your team, as I'm sure lots of people of faith have throughout this lockdown period. But thank you for making time today.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to be here, and I appreciate those kind words. You just need to look at my inbox to know it's not a universal view. So depending on what we decide to be open, my inbox changes. So just now it's full of beauty therapy, massage therapy, and bingo halls seems to be the latest challenge, and swimming pools. So the group is getting smaller as we come out of lockdown, but there's still not a universal view that we're doing a good job, but we're certainly trying our best.
Thank you so much. So I know our time is kind of restricted, and people have been sending in tons of questions, Jason. So I'm going to kick right in with them, if that's okay. And I really wanted to start with things around a sort of gathered church service, if you like, and the kind of what that might look like going forward. So we've had questions around should people be wearing masks going in? What happens if the aisles between pews in older churches are not wide enough to social distance around? Should people be singing? If not, why not? And musicians up the front, should they be social distancing? What does that kind of look like? So there's just been a little bit of uncertainty about what church is kind of going to look like going forward and what the main issues for that main gathered worship will be. So have you any advice on, I guess, all of that stuff that you can share?
Yeah, so it's difficult. And the first thing to say is that if your church is normal, you've misunderstood. So let me put what we're dealing with in perspective first, Fred, if you'll forgive me, and then we can move to the specific guidance, maybe to help people understand what it is we're trying to do here. So Ebola, the last time that the WHO declared a global public health emergency a number of years ago in West Africa, Ebola was a deadly disease, a viral disease that killed quite a number of people, but actually infected 30,000 people globally. 30,000. I mean, tragic, and had a very high death rate amongst those 30,000. We got one case in Scotland. I know her name. I know which hospital she went to, and I know her outcomes. The present position today of COVID-19 in the world is we have 12.5 million infected individuals. Last Friday, 260,000 people caught this disease, and 600,000 people have died. This is like nothing that has ever happened in the world, ever. And I think people somewhat misunderstand the scale of this challenge. This is, of course, about opening bingo halls, and of course about getting places of worship back to work, and of course about retail and the health service and social care. But it is a global pandemic. So let's not misunderstand what it is we're dealing with. That's my first point. And I don't do that to scare people. I do that to keep it in perspective. Now, Scotland has had less than 20 positive cases for about 2 weeks now every day. We've had our first death today in a week related to COVID. So Scotland is doing well. But it's a tough thing to celebrate when 40,000 people, when 40,000 people have died of this disease over the last few months. So we have to be careful about how we celebrate fewer deaths. And we need to be awfully reticent about what we do next, which is why the route map is slow. It's slow in industry, slow in retail, and unfortunately for this crowd, it's also slow in places of worship. However, from the 15th, I think that's a big step. I think it's a big step that we can now meet again in buildings, indoors, which we haven't allowed much anywhere else, Remember, indoors is much more worrying. And services, Fred, you're right. We can maybe come to some of the specifics, but the rules are going to be, you have to keep a register of attendees. You have to kind of have a COVID officer, somebody who will be responsible for keeping the regulations. You have to physically distance outside households. So you have to be 2 meters apart as much as you possibly can on the way in, the way out, and when you're seated. So that will mean in my church, my Baptist church, that will mean heavily limiting our attendees. We probably won't get up to the maximum of 50. We probably won't manage to get 50 in the building. So we'll have to think about what that means. We'll have to think about maybe not starting right away. We might carry on with our streaming services in conjunction with another Baptist church who have been very helpful. So we're not going to get back to normal, and not soon. No singing, I'm afraid. The science is not particularly strong, but we're very, very worried about indoors, and we're very worried about droplet spread. That's how this virus spreads in the main, from droplets from you which contain virus, settle on surfaces, or hit somebody else. We're not making face coverings compulsory in places of worship just now, but we are suggesting that if you think you cannot physically distance, or you think it's crowded, then face coverings will do no harm at all, and you should think about it. The other individual question you asked was about worship bands or musicians. Yes, but physically distant, unless they are in the same household. So this is all about limiting the opportunities for the virus to jump from family to family, from household to household. It's quite difficult to avoid it if it's already in your household, and that's why we're so concerned about individual households. So you could show, if you have a screen, you could show worship on the screen. You could have musicians play. You could have, so there are innovative ways, but it is not going to be a normal service. I'm sorry, I thought it more important to get the places open if we could, even with the limited ability they have to conduct normal communal worship.
No, I think that's great and very helpful. Thank you. I think it's not so much people almost desperate to get back to a normal. It's more about what does gathering likely to look like, so that people actually do take the advice and the guidelines seriously, and just trying to work out what that looks like in the different settings in which they're kind of involved. Thinking around that, and perhaps the place of children. Most gatherings involve young families or children.
Yep.
And so on, and usually in a lot, children would go out to a different room or a different group. There would be a creche or a kind of Sunday school, something like that. Do you think that's any form of that is likely to be possible, Jason?
Yes, I think that absolutely is possible. Childcare opened on the same day as places of worship, and leading up to this point, we've removed the physical distancing requirements for 11 and unders. So 11 and under do not have to physically distance from anybody else, indoors or outdoors. 12 to 17-year-olds do have to physically distance from each other and from adults. So as long as you can obey those rules, you can have children's work. So you could have a primary school-aged Sunday school, or whatever you want to call it, in a hall, physically distanced from the adults to be physically distanced, but the kids don't. And if you had an older, say a Bible class or a young people's group, that could absolutely meet, but it has to be completely physically distanced between households. It's important here, Fred, there is no risk-free route here. There's no route that takes us out of this without taking risk. And even removing the physical distancing for children was risk, and we chose to take it. So we're not, it's not compulsory that you let the children run about and form different households. You don't have to do that. But we've decided, because of the prevalence of the virus presently in Scotland, it's low enough that we think you can take that. We think you can take that risk.
Great. And I noticed today when John Swinney was kind of talking about possible schools and stuff, he was saying that teachers, adults, would still have to social distance, even if children were not, as far as possible. And that would be the same for Sunday school teachers or creche type watchers.
Correct.
or anything like that.
Correct. But primary schools won't have to physically distance from children because they're not physically distancing. But secondary school teachers will have to physically distance from the kids. Now, this is important. There's inconsistencies all over this guidance now, because as you open different pieces of the puzzle, there are inconsistencies. And everybody says to me, why can we do this in a pub and we can't do this in a place of worship? Or why can we do this in a gym and we can't do this over here? Well, that's because we've got headroom. The population has given us headroom in order to do things. And the cabinet, the First Minister and the cabinet, then make choices with what to do with that headroom based on the advice from me and a whole host of other people. And they're trying to create a balance between what you do for the vulnerable, what you do with the headroom in schools, what you do with it about tourism or hospitality or oil and gas and places of worship. Trying to balance that puzzle to try and not give us a peak of virus, but open up the economy, culture, society, and everything else is really, really hard about how you might do that. And I think adding places of worship was a big step, but, and I'm sounding a little bit, I need to get a bit more positive perhaps as time passes. The last thing we want is an outbreak in a church. I mean, if we got a super spreader event from a positive individual that spread quickly to a church community, that would set not just that church back, but it would set a number of things back, which is why the guidelines are so important. Quite a lot of the super spreader events around the world have been places of worship. And places of worship are one of the few places where all ages meet in the one place. If you think about it, it's quite unusual for newborn babies and 9-year-olds to meet in the same building at the same time. So churches, mosques, synagogues are some of the few places where that dynamic occurs. And that's one of the reasons why we're cautious, because we've got to be careful that we don't get positive cases spread throughout that environment.
Now that's great, and that actually leads me on to another point, Jason. As part of the shielding community myself at the moment, and kind of working from home, as restrictions on more vulnerable groups are starting to ease a little bit. Looking forward, do you think that sort of the gathering church or gathered church, what would be your advice to the over 70s, the previously shielding folks as we move later into the summer, and more vulnerable folks about gathering in these kind of indoor settings?
So three groups roughly in society. We've dealt with the under 12s, so they're kind of getting special privileges. 3 remaining groups of everything from 12 and upwards. The easy answer to your question is the shielded group. The shielded group, special rules, they're not coming to gatherings of any kind, not yet. So they are on a separate route map out, and they will eventually get permission to do that. That's 180,000 people. That's a group of people who have immunosuppression, who have transplants, who are having chemotherapy. So they have got individual letters. They've got an individual route map out. They will not be in places of worship anytime in the next little while. The over 70s, those who get the flu vaccine for health reasons, and pregnant women, they are in with the rest of us, but they are asked to take particular care. It's not particularly specific. It doesn't help us that much, other than they are vulnerable. The single biggest risk for this disease is age. By a country mile, by a factor of hundreds, the biggest single risk to death and serious disease is age. So over 80s in particular are at high risk, 70s worse than 60s, 60s worse than 50s, and 40s worse than 14. So there's a kind of exponential curve that rises with age. So my parents are 79. One has no pre-existing conditions really of any kind, and one has a respiratory pre-existing condition. I will probably be suggesting to the one with the COPD that she not attend church for a little while yet. But the other one, my dad, it'd be difficult for me to keep him away because he doesn't listen. But I would expect him to go to a physically distanced service, separate from other people, except his own household, and obey the rules. And I am comfortable with the risk that will be. So we just have to be careful with what we tell our congregations and our people about risk. Because if you come it's more risky than staying in the house. But we can't stay in the house forever. So we've got to do that, but we've got to do it slowly.
Brilliant. Thank you. We had a few people asking questions round about the different vulnerable kind of groupings. If we move on to what churches in their buildings do quite often through the week, toddler groups, lunch groups, support groups for the most vulnerable in society. We had questions around what does deep cleaning actually mean as opposed to, if you like, normal cleaning? How is that going to work with the different groups that come in? And will groups have to try and get the details of everybody who's coming to a different group? Specifically, a couple of folks asked, some of the more vulnerable groups, they move around quite a lot. People who have addiction issues and other things, not so keen to give up their details and so on. So what, in a sense, what are the obligations on church groups, outreach type of groups, and how should they progress going forward?
You may not like the answer, but the answer is pretty straightforward, is yes. Everybody who comes onto the premises and is remotely at risk of passing on or catching the virus needs to be in a register. The reason for that is test and protect is our crucial way out of lockdown. So test and protect is anybody with a positive test then gets their contacts traced. And that's how we interrupt the chains of transmission of the virus. So you have to have that connection so you know who these people are. Now, that's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect in a beer garden or in a mother and toddlers group. We completely understand that. But we need to do our best to manage that list of people as best we can. We have had, in my church, we've had a food bank throughout the pandemic. That food bank has carried on. So essential services have been allowed the whole way along.
Yes.
So the church buildings have been open for. So I've heard of elements like food banks, community services. Some churches have opened to especially cook for the homeless, or especially cook for the vulnerable neighbours nearby. Mosques have done the same. Nobody's suggesting that can't happen. We've just got to do it in a safe way. Midweek and other worship services can happen, but the same rules apply. So the distancing, the singing, the gathering, the no more than 50, all of that is exactly the same. So you can do it, but you've just got to be mindful of trying to find ways of staying within the guidance, not trying to find ways to push the guidance. Because the reason it's there is so we don't get a spike in cases. If we get a spike in cases, there'll be no church services, and there'll be no beer gardens and no retail either. But so it's really fragile, and we've got to be so careful. And we certainly don't want this bit of the puzzle coming unstuck. Cleaning, deep cleaning's a slightly artificial term, which I use and others use, and so the trick here is that the virus likes shiny surfaces. So it likes wooden pews, it likes glass, it likes metal, it likes shiny brass banisters. It doesn't particularly like fabric, soft furnishing, clothes. It can lie there a while, but it dies quick. So remove everything you don't need. So we've removed all our pew Bibles, all our pew cushions, all the multiple leaflets that hang about, the vases of flowers. It's a shame, but that's what we've done. So we've removed all the superfluous stuff. We've removed all the songbooks, all of that. And now it's much, much easier to clean as we go through. And a decent surface cleaning of all of that stuff will clean it perfectly adequately. So a spray and a cloth, a disinfectant, or wipes would take a bit of time. So just as if you were giving it a good, decent clean, you're just going to have to do it more often. And you should do it between events if you possibly can. So you should do it, if you're going to have two services, you should do it between morning and evening. If you're going to have a mother and toddlers and then you're having Sunday school in the same place, I would clean it between them. But that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be buying a fancy machine. Just means keep the place clean of clutter, clean all the stuff that people have used, and clean down the surfaces. We're not having communal tea and coffee, I'm afraid. We're not having catering. So none of that is going to be happening in the meantime. So it should be relatively straightforward to keep the place tidy. Childcare, so mother and toddlers groups and specific regulated childcare, has special guidance all of its own, which you can find online. And that's about keeping surfaces and toys and all other kinds of things clean as well.
Brilliant, thank you. It's interesting you talk about your own church. We've now compiled a list of about 85 different amazing stories of churches across Scotland and what they've been doing in the lockdown in terms of their community engagement and working with different groups, and some really, really encouraging stories happening. What you said with regard to the childcare sort of specific legislation leads me to another question that somebody asked, was that cafes that are actually in churches, the church I used to run in Perth had a community cafe, and somebody's asking, do they come under legislation around or guidelines around church and worship, or under hospitality, or where do they actually sit if you run it almost as a business?
They're hospitality. So they are indoor hospitality. Very, very strict guidelines about how and when they should open. And you need to think very carefully whether that's what you want to do. You are allowed to do it, but there's very strict guidance about what that looks like, about registers, about keeping a note of everybody who comes, about keeping people, they get an exemption to the distancing. So they're allowed 1 meter distancing if they choose to do it. They don't have to. But that means everybody within that area would be contact traced if there were a positive case, because 1 meter is too small and contact tracing would get them. So you have to think carefully about whether you want to do it. But yes, it is permitted, and it is indoor hospitality, which we opened yesterday.
Brilliant, thank you. I know that time is rushing away from us, but can I move on to almost separate type of churches? Many of the churches in Scotland don't come from or use traditional buildings anymore. There's either new types of buildings, or there's been a lot of churches now, church plants from networks and so on that use schools, community buildings, leases, and so on. And some have been asking us what is the likelihood of what guidelines would a worshipping community in a school over a weekend, if they could get a booking back in that school, what does that look like for them?
So it's so difficult because you can't cut with national guidance. You can't cover every single eventuality. So we would ask people to look at what we've said, look at the guidance by individual denomination, because and I don't mean just choose your own denomination. I mean the Baptist guidance is good, the Church of Scotland guidance is good, the Catholic guidance is good. So you'll get clues if you look through the organized religion, if you'll forgive the expression, and what they've managed to put in place. And their guidance in some places is very, very specific. It may not apply to your specific setting. If you happen to be in a small town and you use a community centre, we probably haven't covered that specific eventuality because we simply can't. So I would ask you to use your common sense and think about what it is you're doing. That you don't get to say, well, we're not really a conventional place of worship, so we can ignore the guidance. That doesn't really work. You should say, we're not a traditional place of worship, so how can we make the guidance fit our setting? And that will still include distancing, hand washing, face coverings if you're worried about crowds, except ventilation of the room, all those other elements. So that doesn't seem impossible for smart people to think about what that would look like in a primary school or in a community centre or in somebody's home, whatever it is they're trying to do. So I would have thought, just use your common sense, apply the guidance to your context, and do your best to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really, I guess just picking up on two last ones quickly, if that's okay with.
I've got a little bit of time to go past the hour if you've paid the electricity meter.
Well, there's no guarantees on that, right enough. I come from Fife, Jason, so paying for anything if we don't have to is always a challenge. some of the fastest growing churches in Scotland, and indeed in the UK, are the black majority ethnic churches. Obviously, some research has been done into that ethnic mix and its responsiveness to the virus. Is there any particularly special guidelines or thoughts behind the gatherings for those communities?
It's a very, very important question, and the research is still developing, so it's difficult to be definitive. But we do know now. Remember, this virus is only 6 months old in the whole world. We've had it since the end of February, beginning of March in this country, and we now know that there are risk factors for serious illness and disease. There's not a risk factor for catching the bug. The bug doesn't know what you are or who you are or where you came from or what age you are. You catch the bug. The difference is in how severe the illness is and death, potentially. We know that the biggest risk factor, we've already touched on it, is age. The second biggest risk factor is comorbidity or other disease, both respiratory disease and what we would call vascular disease in the round, so diabetes, obesity, heart failure, things that affect your vascular system. But there is a remaining risk if you are non-white. And all the research suggests that to be true, particularly in London. But more recently, we've published some data in Scotland where we don't have the huge ethnic mix that they have in London. But in Scotland, there is definitely a risk, particularly of being Southeast Asian and Bangladeshi. Now, that doesn't mean we can exclude risk from other ethnic groups because we just don't know. And we haven't had enough disease and enough death. And enough, I mean, that's a horrible way of putting it, but you understand we just don't have the numbers. So my advice is to do risk assessment based on your population. And if your population is all over 90, then that puts your risk up. If your population is all non-white, that puts your risk up less, but puts it up a little. But the mitigation is the same. You just have to be a bit stricter. So you still need to distance, you still need to wash your hands, you still need to do all these other things. And the risk is not so high that we're telling the Bangladeshi community to behave any differently. So we're not telling the Bangladeshi community to shield, for instance, or to not go to shops. We're telling everybody to be really cautious, and there is definitely a higher risk in some ethnic groups. So that would suggest to me you should make the guidance as good as you can and as tight as you can. The really interesting thing for a longer conversation is why. Because there doesn't seem to be a biological reason for it. There might be, but that would be unusual for a virus. So it is much more likely to be institutional. It is more likely to be society and housing and inequality and poverty, access to care, access to support, language. There's a big list of why those health inequalities are often worse in ethnic minority societies than they are in the white community.
Brilliant, thank you. It's great to see so many churches, multi-ethnic churches, growing in Scotland and bringing such a great diversity to what the church is. But that's a question that we got relating to that. And I guess the last one is the ways in which people are looking at church in back gardens or in parks or even in extended house groups now. So we've had a couple of questions about singing in house groups. Is this singing guidance, advice right across the board? So if people are gathering to do a wee Bible study of 3 or 4 families in a house or 2 families, whatever it is, or out in a garden, they should just avoid, I mean, there's lots more to worship than just singing, but they should just avoid singing altogether. Would that be your advice?
But fundamentally, yes. Don't try and find ways around it by meeting in smaller groups. So yes, meet in your house groups. The problem here is droplets. So you're not having karaoke in your family gathering either. So we're trying to limit the risk as little as we can. And some of that sounds pretty severe. I don't like it. I am going to find that difficult in the worship services to have no communal singing. But do we want to wait to open places of worship until we can sing? I made a judgment that maybe not. So we're not going to have communal communion cups. Many fellowships will find that really, really difficult. In mosques and synagogues and other places where I've discussed with worship leaders, with faith leaders around the country, they've got different challenges. So ablutions is a real problem in the Islamic community, and chanting is a real responsive chanting in the Jewish community is a real problem. So every faith community is going to have to compromise. But let's be completely clear: the people who own the gyms, the swimming pools, the sports clubs, the shops, the bingo halls, they're compromising too. There is nobody back to normal, because we can't go back to normal. 600,000 people are dead. It's not going to be normal for some time. So I understand why the questions are being asked, and we have to. I'm not trying to dodge them. I'm very happy to answer them, but that's why it doesn't feel that everybody's getting everything that they would like.
Yeah, no, and to be fair, I think to the folks who are asking us questions, really, most of them, I think, understand that we're almost going into a new season, or some people are talking about a winter season. After a blizzard, you have a winter season, and so things are different from before to the after and the coming out of all that. Sorry,
Fred. I was going to say, I think church, evangelical church specifically, has played an absolute blinder. We've had more people at prayer meetings than we've ever had in 15 years on Zoom, and we've had connections to other churches who have more resources than ours to stream their services. We've had kids clubs connected. We've had virtual Bible classes. So I hope we don't throw all that out. I think some of that is here to stay, just like virtual appointments in the health service is here to stay. So I think that pandemics are not good. There's no good in a pandemic. But some of the things you learn in adversity, in being forced to do things, actually, I think will last longer. I was told that none of our people would. Some of the elderly people, they would never connect online. They would never engage in that. Last night we had people in their 80s in their homes on new iPads connecting to a Zoom prayer meeting with no help from 14-year-old kids or others helping them. So there's a lot that's possible. We need to be careful not to exclude other people, but in some sense, our traditional form of church excludes people.
Yes.
So we've got to take the good that we've created and now adapt it to this middle ground to get back to what might be a new normal.
Yes, no, I totally agree, and I think that's where we need some almost imagination and creativity, and trying to sense both what we feel God is saying and also what is happening round about us. And it's been great. We had a lot of regional leaders gatherings over the months on Zoom, just to hear what people have been doing and connecting with one another, and some really creative work, and also fantastic to see some people whose gifts within congregations have perhaps not always been utilized the way they might, coming into their own in some ways in this new setting, which I think is really, really exciting for us, and certainly exciting for younger people who in the main know the technology so well. Suddenly they've become indispensable to some congregations.
Indeed. Well, and that's terrific.
Terrific. Absolutely. I think I don't want to take up any more of your time. I guess we've gone over anyway. Is there anything you would like to say to the folks who are going to see this live or recorded as we move on?
Well, Fred, just as I haven't looked at everybody's, but I've seen a couple of quick fire questions in the chat, and maybe it would be helpful to give my views of some of them. Somebody asked if the over 70s, the vulnerable group, can steward and welcome people. Yes, they can if they're willing to do that, but that is higher risk than a 30-year-old doing it. Yeah, absolutely they can, but they need to understand. Everybody needs to understand that that is always higher risk for those people. Plexiglass for worship leaders? No, you do not need to set up plexiglass for worship leaders. But if you're in a small space, you need to think about distancing. If you're in a big space, the worship leader can be at the front and physically distanced. Worship leaders singing by themselves is an interesting one. I think probably yes, but very distanced, maybe even facing the wrong way. So it might be that you would have them sitting in the front pew leading some reflective worship from there rather than facing the crowd. But the droplets would have to spread quite a long way to get there. The challenge is the distance. So yes, you could have somebody up the front leading worship, but we want to avoid loud and we want to avoid congregational singing at this point. No communal communion cups. I think we covered that already. We're worried even about distribution of communion trays and communion cups. We're worried about offering bags. So all surfaces. Imagine the virus were luminescent and somebody random in the room had it and you don't know who it is. And how quickly that virus, particularly in an environment like a church where things are passed, could potentially spread. And you don't know if the steward who has the cups or has the plate or has the bag has the virus. You just don't know. No. So therefore, for now, with the level we have in the country just now, we're saying no to anything passing between people. And I think you can probably understand why with those elements. And then somebody's asking if you sing wearing a mask. No, don't try and find a way through the singing guidance. No singing. I couldn't have been clearer. And then the final one is about the what was I going to say? Oh, the 50. So some people saying, can we go to more than 50 in bigger places? No, you can't. But the 50 is temporary, and over time the 50 will be increased. We just need to wait and get through some of this to get to bigger groups. Just now, indoors for 50 is a big step from yesterday, a massive step. So I am very worried about indoors. I'm worried about indoor pubs. I'm worried about indoor places of worship. I'm worried about cinemas. I'm worried about everything we've opened indoors. So that's why we're a bit cautious about the numbers. And I hope that won't be for too long, but that's the rule just now.
And can I just clarify one thing then, Jason, just as we close, that connection between funerals and funerals that take place in churches, there still seems to be a little bit confusion in some folks. The number at a funeral is 20, but the number in a church can be at its maximum up to 50. Where do we go with a funeral that takes place in a church?
20. Weddings and funerals, 20 people only. And we've expanded that it doesn't have to be just direct family, which is what it was up until yesterday. And it doesn't, but wherever the funeral or wedding happens, and there is still a ban on wakes and still a ban on wedding receptions, but you can now have a wedding or a funeral in a place of worship or in a crematorium, but it's 20 people. Now, that's not exact science, the 50 to 20, I understand that's an inconsistency. The reason for that is everybody will know each other. There is more temptation and more struggle to keep everybody apart and stop everybody hugging each other. And so it's a balance, and the balance has landed on 50 and 20. I'm not sure that's perfect, but that's the feel.
Fantastic. There's stuff coming in all the time, and we have to draw a line at some point. And I think this great. Is there any particular thing, Jason, that you want to leave with the folks online, or the folks who will see this throughout the week? Any bit of advice or thoughts you have?
So I think my fundamental message is embrace it. Embrace it as an opportunity for worship, for evangelism, for everything that your church is about, community engagement. Take advantage of what we presently have and use it. And don't try and find ways around it or think about how you can maybe expand the guide. Just embrace the guidance for what it is. And I hope, like many others, and you have advocates in the conversations about making sure this guidance doesn't stay in place, restricted for too long, and we will get you out of it just as soon as we can. But in the meantime, embrace it as an opportunity to gather as a group of people, perhaps for the first time for 4 months, and to engage with your community.
Fantastic. Jason, we really appreciate the time that you've given today, and your advice. You can see on the live comments, people have been really helped by what you've shared, and so thank you so much for that. And we will be continuing to pray for you and to pray for your team, and just asking God to protect you and grant you a kind of rhythm where at least occasionally you get a break and a step away from this. So thank you so much, and we pray that God will bless you in all that He's called you to do at this time.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you. So thank you so much for everybody who has checked into this today. We hope that it's really been helpful for you as you go forward. We've created a lot of resource in helping the church get through lockdown and beyond it. And if you're part of EA, then thank you already. If you're not, we would love you to be part of Evangelical Alliance, and you can find out more on eauk.org/join us. We'd love for you to be part of who we are. So please check out our resources, check out more of what we've done on our Facebook page or on our website, and join a movement to see our nation changed. Thank you.